is sin. And I was a little bit nervous initially when I was asked to give this presentation a couple of years ago. And Tom said, well, why are you so nervous? And, I was talking about, me being a sinner. And he says, well, you got this. You know how to sin. So he just affirmed what I was thinking. That's what we do for each other. I'll do it. So it's no surprise that sin is a dividing factor when it comes to our relationship with God and others. And so I just wanted to ask, who in the room is a sinner? Why do we not have all the hands up? Okay, just wondering. Okay, we might have some work to do. Well, we actually are all sinners, and I don't know if Father Irwin, he's not here. Even Father Irwin is a sinner. Don't let him tell you otherwise. So tonight we're going to look at sin as part of our journey through salvation history. We're going to look at original sin. So who started this whole thing? Who is responsible for it, right? Guilty by association. We're going to talk about how sin is actually a separation from God, the types of sin, and then last we're going to talk about Catholic morality. Because you can't talk about sin without talking about morality. So we're all called to be saints, not sinners, and we are called to live an ordered life. Over the past year or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, I don't know how many years, I can't tell you how many homilies I've heard where the priest talks about how God is calling us all to be saints, not sinners. And you might hear you might hear priests talk about that throughout the year. And the other thing is we're called to be in community with each other and with God, because we're called to help each other get to heaven. So we're all called to be saints. We're called to be saints together. So let's go to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It teaches us that sin is an offense against reason, truth, and right conscience. It's a failure to love God and neighbor, and it's a perverse attachment to an object. So where we get into trouble is when we start to look at things or we objectify things. So for example, let's take a look at, there are certain things where, it's okay to have an attachment to, like our caregivers, right, to certain people. But when that becomes perverse or when it's distorted, then it becomes a problem. It's an unhealthy attachment. Like for instance, let's talk about sex, right? And that's unhealthy. Let's talk about sex. So that's a healthy thing. It's a healthy attachment. It's a connection between a man and a woman, a husband and wife. But if we start to view pornography, or if we start to have affairs, that sort of thing, then sex, by its very nature, is good, then becomes an unhealthy attachment. So what we also know about sin is that it's wounding to human nature and solidarity. So it's so if we think back to the Kerygma, right? We were created. We were created in the image and likeness of God. We learned that goodness is foundational and evil is not. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. But then we were fallen. That's where sin comes in. And sin wounds us. It distorts us. But fortunately, there's good news because we were also redeemed. Sin is also, think about it, it's an offense against God. So if we think of it that way, how grave actually is sin? It's pretty grave, isn't it? Yeah. And in the can't think of it, the prayer that you say at confession. There's a part in it.
Act of contrition?
Yes, act of contrition. obviously I need to go to confession.
I like the cheat sheets they have in there now.
Right. So in that prayer, though, it says, God help me to avoid, all occasions of sin. Okay? Because that sin separates us from God. So yes, sin is a big deal, and it is the elephant in the room. Who all here likes to talk about sin? Yeah, Tom likes to talk about sin. There's a few people here who like to talk about sin. So to get a good understanding of sin, we have to look at salvation history, and we've done a little bit of that already. Genesis tells us that humans are created by God in the image and after the likeness of God. In the image of God, He created them. Male and female, He created them. In the beginning, everything was great in the garden. Adam and Eve were close to God and to each other. There was no shame. God had given them everything, including dominion over all that He created on earth. Life was very ordered. God created us as unique, having a special dignity and value as persons. It is God's gift of love that continually sustains us and allows us to reciprocate His love. We talked about, in the marriage talk, we talked about how God is faithful to us. Right? He loves us unconditionally. We are created as a unified whole, having a material body and spiritual soul. And we are called to be in communion with God and others. We are called to flourish. We're not called to languish. And sin helps us to languish. So after Adam and Eve's decision to disobey God, guess what? Things kind of changed in the garden, didn't they? It became very disordered and full of trials. It became full of pain and suffering. Thanks, Adam and Eve, right? Their sin effectively separated them from God. And this pattern persisted throughout future generations, and we experience it today. But separation from God is a matter of free will. Because God is immutable. God doesn't change. We're the ones that turn away from God. God doesn't turn away from us. Sometimes we feel separated or we feel like we're in the middle of a desert. Has anyone experienced that feeling? Yeah, I have. A lot. It is because we're moving away from God and not the other way around. So consider that if you feel like you're in a desert. It's also called desolation. Also, just ask God, what is it that you want me to learn from this desolation? He doesn't want us to stay there. Not really. He just wants us to, whatever it is, He wants us to learn from that desolation so that we can quickly move into consolation. So with this said, there are many events in our life that can precipitate that separation as a result of depression, trauma, life stressors. We can become distressed or injured by natural causes or by others' harmful behaviors, which cause us to have a kind of a trauma response. We also have varying levels of conscious and unconscious distorted experiences in our lives. Sometimes our life experiences cause us to have core beliefs that are distorted and that lead us to not respecting ourselves and sometimes others. So those core beliefs happen over a lifetime. Usually we develop those at a very early age and we carry those through into adulthood. And what I mean by core beliefs is some of the most popular ones are I don't matter. I'm unlovable. I'm not worth anything. Okay, can any of you just kind of do popcorn, right? Name some core beliefs that maybe you experience or maybe you know someone experiences those.
You can't trust anyone.
Very good, yes. And that's often a trauma response too. And it can happen in a couple of different ways. It can happen, maybe your childhood was great, and then something happens, and now you can't trust anyone. Or it can happen, maybe your childhood wasn't great, and you learn not to trust anyone, that it wasn't safe. So yes, very good. Anybody else? And those are hard to share. They're very personal. Yes?
Abandonment.
Abandonment, yeah. And so what would that core belief be?
A sense of loss, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
if you've ever been abandoned, you don't really know what to feel about it.
Yeah, so it's not
Distrust.
safe. People aren't, it's
Yeah,
not safe to attach
distrust.
to people because they're just gonna leave me anyway. They're going to abandon me. Right? Yeah, yeah. So we talked about created. I'm going to review this again. So the charisma again, created, created, fallen, and then redeemed. And so we were created, and now sin enters into the picture. Original sin was the result of freedom or our free will put to the test. But man failed the test, and I mean that man and woman, right? I'm not just picking on men. Man failed the test. Well, I don't know. So man failed the test because he chose himself over God. As a result, we are all implicated in this sin. So guilty by association. So if maybe you can think back to maybe gym class when they used to have gym class, right? So when somebody messed up. So now everybody has to do push-ups or everybody has to run laps, right? So you're just guilty by association. Everyone shares in that mishap or that misbehavior. Paul writes that by one man's disobedience,
Many were made sinners.
many were made sinners. Okay, yeah, that didn't make sense because the Y dropped. Okay, so Paul writes that by one man's disobedience, many were made sinners. Okay, so this is like a Catholic word. Concupiscence. This is up there with, what's the other word?
Magnanimity.
Magnanimity. So there are some words in the Catholic Church that you have to learn how to say before you can be confirmed.
Scare everybody off.
Yeah.
The Archbishop will ask you to pronounce this. If you hit the wrong vowel with the accent, it's over.
That's right. So it is through this inclination to sin, or concupiscence, that causes us to remain disordered. So it's that inclination toward. Again, our goodness is foundational, okay? But we have this inclination towards sin. The Catechism teaches us that human appetites or desires which remain disordered due to the temporal consequences of original sin, which remain even after baptism. That's why we have to continue. That's why we have to confess, and we have to continue to try and live the best life that we can live. Because just because you're baptized doesn't mean that everything is good. It's a continuous process. Okay. So it remains even after baptism. And because we always have this inclination to sin. So here's what I was talking about before. Goodness is foundational and evil is not. And evil opposes God. So evil is not a thing. Rather, it is the absence of good. So think about darkness. What is darkness? It's the absence of light. So we can think of evil as the absence of good. Sometimes we give evil, or Satan, we give it way too much power over our lives. Right? The devil made me do it? Yeah. That's giving Satan a lot of power. So, we're gonna do a quick little exercise. Okay, so who has paper? Does everyone have paper? And a writing utensil?
I can write on my phone.
Paper.
Would you like that larger? Not yet, since you're ready.
Okay, and does anyone need paper? You got it? What?
Yeah, just write it down.
Oh, it requires you to actually write with, yeah. So, although technology is great, this is actually just an exercise, a visual exercise, yeah.
Well, you're not writing anything yet.
That's cute.
Well, I'm not going to start it yet because I wanted to also just reiterate what I said before. So the tendency toward evil is a disordering of inclinations that are themselves basically good. So for example, we talked about connection and intimacy and attachment, right? That's good. We want to feel connected to people. But if we go out and we have affairs, extramarital affairs, then that's not so good, right? That's a distortion of something that is foundationally good. Okay, so I wanted to make sure we covered that because that's kind of what this exercise is about. So is everybody ready? Yes. Okay. So to demonstrate how sin can distort inclinations, remember we talked about inclinations as being good. Everyone, go ahead and take out a piece of paper, find a pen if you don't have it, tell Tom if you don't. And then with your dominant hand, I don't know which one is your dominant hand, but whichever one is, write on that piece of paper that I am a saint. Even if you're not, just go ahead and write it. I am a saint.
So now we have all lied.
Now we all gotta go.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Is everyone done? Okay, so somewhere else on that paper or on the other side of the paper, now with your opposite hand, your non-dominant hand, write the same thing. Write, I am a saint.
I had a stroke, I can't do that.
I didn't have one, I can't do this.
I think that is occupational therapy.
Almost the same.
No, I wanted to do mine backwards.
Oh, there you go.
Really good.
This really isn't bad.
Well, it's either not bad or my regular handwriting is bad.
Mine, yeah.
Might be it. Could be
Okay, everyone. So what do you see?
Distortions.
A distortion, right? Yeah. So what did you experience when you were doing it? You were uncomfortable. Okay. It was a distortion. I was uncomfortable. What else? Unnatural. Right. Did you have have any body sensations that came up for you? Like something that kind of came up? Like anxiety? Okay. Where did you feel that anxiety?
Right here.
Right here in the chest, right? Right here in the heart. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's a really good example, because when we sin, don't we feel it in our heart? Yeah, we do. It's telling us something. So if you're wondering if you're sinning, listen to your body. Listen to those things that come up. Because it's probably trying to tell you something.
So we just sinned?
It's part of the training process.
Yeah. Okay, but really, choosing between good and evil is not as simple as choosing between vanilla and chocolate ice cream, is it? No, it's much deeper than that. So let's go to the Catechism again. The Catechism teaches us that the root of sin is in the heart of man in his free will, according to the teaching of the Lord. For out of the heart came evil thoughts, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a man. But in the heart also resides charity, the source of the good and pure works, which sin wounds. So sinning sometimes causes us to think that God has washed his hands of us, that he can never forgive our terrible sin. But we know this isn't true. We know that God is faithful to us and has unconditional love for us. So remember the story of the adulteress. Let's listen for Jesus' reaction. Tom, do you want to read it? Okay. Do you want to be Jesus?
I can read it.
You want to be Jesus?
Sure.
Okay. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said to him, "You all can be the
They can't see
scribes and
this.
the you can't? Oh, okay. Well then, never mind. Okay. So you be the quotes.
Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act committing adultery.
Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They said this to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him.
Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first one to throw a stone at her."
And once again he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the elders, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him.
Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?"
She said, "No one, sir."
And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again."
Jesus does not condemn us when we sin. He forgives us in advance from the cross on the condition that we sincerely repent and try to avoid sinning again. And that's also kind of the basis of confession, too. Confession is a sacrament that actually is very healing. But the idea is not to go and confess your sin only to turn around and keep doing it. The idea is to try not to do it. We know, it's not going to be perfect, but we do try not to sin again, right? And so that's, yeah. Confession is not meant to be, oh, I did something. If I do something bad, I'm just going to go to confession and it's going to take care of it. Do you have a question, Megan?
No.
Okay.
But I've heard people say, they're like, well, if I don't sin, then what did Jesus die for?
Oh, no.
Oh, well, that's a justification I've not heard.
And we'll talk about that tonight.
Yeah. And so, what if you do sin again? We talked a little bit about that, but think of it as like a baby soils his diapers. I only have 6 minutes. Okay. So what if the baby soils his diapers again? Same thing. The cycle repeats itself, right? Our dogs poop in their crate, even though we have a box that they're supposed to poop in. Okay, but they poop again and again and again, and we have to clean it up, right? So I guess that's kind of like sin. So,
And on your mind right now.
and on my mind right now. So anyway, yeah.
It's fresh wound.
It's a trauma response. I'm sorry. So we bring our sins to Jesus, and so we confess, and He forgives us. So the 10 Commandments. Okay, we're gonna breeze through this really quick, right? I only have 6 minutes for the whole thing.
For the rest of your son.
Oh wow. Okay, I'm gonna hurry. Okay, so we'll get through this. So where is the guidance document on becoming a saint, or the roadmap that provides a detour around sin? Do we have one of those? The 10 Commandments, right? Well, let's start there. That is a good place to start. So, assuming we follow the 10 Commandments, isn't this enough to save us if we just follow the 10 Commandments? No. Yeah. So, it's a good place to start. Some good guidelines, though, right? Seriously. If you're a regulator, you know what guidelines are. Right, Dustin?
Regulator?
Right. Are you? Well, I mean, you work for the state.
Oh,
so.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I'm quite rigid.
Right. So we can think of the 10 Commandments as minimum rules of behavior for loving God and neighbor. Minimum, right? We don't stop there. So what do the first 3 commandments have in common? Anyone know?
Yeah, they relate to the Lord, to God.
Uh-huh.
God.
Yeah, they deal with how we are to love God, right? Okay. The remaining 7 commandments, what do those relate to? Your neighbor. Yeah, exactly, your neighbor. So loving God, your neighbor, right? And loving yourself is the greatest commandment of all. Jesus says it's the Shema, right?
Loving God's the greatest commandment.
Well, loving God is the greatest
And
commandment
neighbor.
of God. But what did Jesus say? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind.
Love your neighbor
Neighbor as yourself. But guess what? If you don't love yourself, it's kind of hard to love your neighbors, isn't it? It's kind of hard to love God if you don't love yourself. If you hate yourself, what does that mean? Yeah. So think about that. So we're not going to go through each of these 10 commandments. I think most everyone is familiar with them.
Oh, that's my editing mistake, not Farrell's.
Yeah. Yeah.
Make it be better.
But really just kind of reflect on the 10 Commandments. There's some beautiful work that has been done on the 10 Commandments, and it really breaks it down in a beautiful way. Okay, so the types of sin. Do you want to take this on?
Sure. So in the Catholic Church, we talk about 2 different types of sin. There's mortal sin, and that is a sin that separates me from God and His grace. It's an act where I have chosen intentionally myself over God and other. And there's venial sin. Venial sin are those things we do that they're wrong. It's a sin. And it definitely puts a rub between me and God. But I'm not condemned for it. It's not a sin of such caliber that God says you don't get in. You know, a white lie. Do I look okay in this today? Sure. When maybe the truth is no, right? Or, you know, a kid not being upfront with their parents, cuts class, doesn't tell them. Adults speeding, technically, we're called to follow civil authority. So I do a pretty good venial sin to and from work each day. That doesn't demand a confession, right? Not going to fall into what we're going to call great sin. Minor lies, minor gossip, but minor being important. Cheating on a game, cheating on a test. These things we shouldn't do. We just talk to God. At Mass, right? Father blesses everybody. And then we go into the act of contrition. I confess to Almighty God and to you, my brothers and sisters. And that is designed to cover these venial sins. It's a time when we reflect and we say, I know I do these things, God. Forgive me, strengthen me, make me better. It should be a goal when we're praying that prayer that we do less, right? That this happens less. But mortal sin is different in that it separates us from God.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just sitting down and taking a rest.
That's okay. So,
Sure, drink it.
No, I'm not going to do
Oh.
this. Yeah, you can have it go.
okay, so mortal sin. To be a mortal sin, it has to be a grave matter. So something significant. And it destroys the divine life in the soul of the sinner because they're choosing to turn from God. Again, if we look at the garden, Adam and Eve made a choice to turn away from God. And God doesn't take our free will away. So if I make a conscious decision to disobey God in a serious matter, and I'm choosing myself over God, then that needs to be reconciled before I can be back in communion with God, right? It's the same thing we have in friendships. If a friend does you wrong in a serious way, you're not going to go sit and eat dinner with them until there's been a reconciliation between the two of you, right? It's not going to work. One of you's chosen to damage and walk away from the relationship. That relationship to be restored requires two things. The person that did it to know they did it and say, I want to fix it. The grace and love of the person who was offended to forgive the act and not hold it against them. Doesn't mean they're making it right? Doesn't say it's okay. No biggie, do it again. That's not the point. It's that it's forgiven and there's no consequence left to bear for it. So it has to be a grave matter. So a grave matter, if I come home and gossip to Farrella about my department chair, and she comes in and she says, I need you to clear this up. And she's such a busybody. Maybe if she and her husband did more together, she wouldn't be in my office all the time breaking my chops. That's a venial sin, right? But if I start gossiping about the teacher in the room next to me, even if it's true about things he's doing in his personal life, things going on where it's affecting his career, his livelihood, his reputation, instead of going to him, now my gossip's a grave matter, right? I'm damaging another human being and I'm choosing to damage them. I'm gossiping with a mission in mind. And if I know that that's what I'm doing, and I'm choosing to do it, I have met the prerequisites of committing mortal sin. I'm there. I have chosen to act contrary to what God said. Jesus said the law and the prophets rest on two things: loving God, loving neighbor. I've ignored God, and I'm damaging my neighbor. I'm choosing me over God and neighbor, and that has to be fixed. Venial sin, on the other hand, we talked about it, it wounds the relationship, right? You find out your buddy, hey, you want to go get a beer? Oh, no, I got to fix the garbage disposal at the house. Then you hear, that he was at a poker party. It's like, whose garbage disposal were you fixing? You're hurt. It wounds, but it doesn't destroy the relationship, right? So it's a wounding, and it does diminish the soul. Anytime we sin, it has this diminishing effect on us until we get it right, because it is choosing self. It's just not at that grave matter of, intent to do true damage, right? Unfortunately, we live in a culture that white lies are considered acceptable because I don't want to hurt their feelings. And that puts us in venal sin. At the same time, we call it a polite society. So it's, to a certain extent, Farrell talked about things that contribute to our sin. Part of what contributes to our sin is just the culture we live in. Doing things the way the culture does it can lead us into a lot of venial sin until we start asking questions. I like to make the distinction between venial sin and mortal sin from a confession I had. I sat down with my spiritual director. I always have to do confession at the end of spiritual direction. And I'm doing my confession. And I'd had a bad week at work and some things, and so I'm letting loose with things I know are bad. I mean, I've thought terrible thoughts about people. I've acted in an unkind way to people. Pretty sure those are mortal sin. And then I just throw out there, I'm just finishing up. I'll clean up the venal stuff too. And I said, and I don't even remember what it was. But I said, and this deal came up, and I didn't want to deal with Farrell with it, so I just lied to her and told her it was taken care of, and I got to get that done, and I feel bad about it. He goes, whoa, hard. Stop. Because I'm not hearing contrition, and we're dealing with mortal sin. I said, lying to my wife's a mortal sin? And he said it's a sacramental relationship. You're called to will the good of that person, and they should have complete trust in you. And this act, he said, is grave because you chose to lie to your wife and hide something from her. You knew you shouldn't be doing it, or you wouldn't be telling me about it, and you had full knowledge when you walked into it. He goes, yeah, so until you feel sorry, we won't be doing absolution. And it shocked me to find out something I thought was kind of a pass, in his mind at least, was mortal. And so it's not, the lines aren't as clear as we like to make them, is what I'm trying to say. But thinking about our actions is something we have to do. Why am I lying? Right? And for me, it was just because it was easier. Venal sin we talked about. Probably my eating habits fall into venal sin, gluttony, not taking care of myself probably the way I should. A lot of times we can fall into venal sin because we're not acting with full knowledge or really consenting to a grave matter. We don't see it as that. You're not accountable at the same level for something you don't know, right? Once you know it's wrong, your responsibility increases, and that's, kind of a tiered part. That's it. It is important to remember, though, we're created in the image and likeness of God. And we have that. And so, question earlier, if I don't sin, what did Christ die for? Right? And so we can go back and we can look at when Jesus is asked about divorce. And his response is telling. Because the Pharisee's confident. Moses allows us to write a divorce. And Jesus says, yep, he did because of the hardness of your heart. But in the beginning, back to Genesis, right? it was not so. And Jesus came to restore the image and likeness and to make it so that not only can we be forgiven our sins, but we can grow into fullness, the joy and peace of learning not to sin. In the Eastern churches, they call it divinization, to become like God, to become a saint. And that's what we're called to be. We're called to be saints. We have to acknowledge we're sinners and have to work to get there. So Catholic moral teaching is the how do we get there? St. Augustine, with his beautiful line, "My heart was restless till I rested in you, O God." My heart stirred, I struggled, I fought. In his confessions, he even makes the comment in his writing them, "When I was out philandering, I did it because it's how you created me. You created me for love, but I knew not where to put my love." So Augustine is back to what Pharaoh was talking about, this good. I'm created to love, to be in community, to be passionate. But if I don't put it in the right place, it turns to sin. It turns inward. So, Farrell talked about the conscience earlier. So, Cardinal John Henry Newman, he's a brilliant man. And he says the conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ. So, vicar is kind of, in modern times, more of a Catholic word. It used to be more of a general word. It's kind of a Catholic word. A vicar stands in the place of, the representative of. And so John Henry Newman says, at our creation, the vicar of Christ, the Word of God, embedded in our hearts and our minds and our very being to guide us. And that when God created us in His image and likeness, He didn't leave us without something. The conscience was part of what God created to give us to be able to live the moral life. So, when we talk about, I just flipped them when I redid this, sorry. When we talk about Catholic moral teaching, Farrell gave us the 10 Commandments to look at. She made this important observation. They're a starting place. They're like the minimum. You know, so I managed to go to work today. I didn't run anybody over. I didn't stop on the way home at the strip bar I drive by. And I have not yelled at a single person today. Does any of that actually make me a good person? No. There are lots of bad people that did the same thing today, right? So there's something more. And so Pope Benedict tells us being a Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or lofty idea, but an encounter with the person, with an event that gives life a new horizon, meaning, and decisive direction. It's an encounter with Christ. Christ was sitting there telling the Pharisee, yeah, but in the beginning it was not so. You're encountering me now, the Word of God, and I will change your life, your being. And that's what being a Christian is. It's this decisive new direction. The church sets out for us how to get there. And G.K. Chesterton says some great things. He says, I don't need a church to tell me I'm wrong when I know I'm wrong. I need a church to tell me I'm wrong when I think I'm right. You know, if I know I'm wrong, I don't need the church to tell me. You know, if I run outside and shoot somebody, I pretty much know I've messed up. But I did need a priest to tell me I was committing mortal sin. because I didn't realize it. I needed somebody to tell me I needed the church to speak to me. Could have been a fellow Christian, right? But I needed someone to speak that truth to me because I couldn't see it. And then he says the Catholic Church is the only thing that frees a man from the degrading slavery of being a child of his age. Going with the flow, how's it happening? Just, it's what everybody's doing. And that's not free. That's falling into, and now we have virtue shaming, cancel culture, all these things, right, that our culture creates. And if I don't want that, then I'm a slave to acting the way they say I should. So the sources for developing our conscience are strengthening our virtue, faith, hope, and love. And Paul tells us they're the greatest of all things. Those are theological virtues. I can cooperate with those. I can't develop them. They're infused by God. Faith, the ability to believe. It's a God-given gift. Hope. Hope that comes because I believe this, right? And love, the capacity to love. God's love, and all love stems from God. So those are the virtues God gives us to strengthen what we call the cardinal virtues. The four basic cardinal virtues: prudence, to think things through, act in a responsible way, right? Temperance being moderation, not teetotal this way, teetotal that way. And I'm not saying if someone has an addiction that applies, obviously, right? Some people, temperance is not to engage. But and so all these virtues are something we have to work through. Justice, to give to God and your neighbor that which is due. St. Thomas Aquinas says every violation of justice is mortal. If you violate justice, according to Thomas Aquinas, you are committing mortal sin. And then fortitude. And I like the word fortitude because this particular virtue, sometimes you hear it called endurance, and sometimes you hear it called courage. But fortitude brings those two together, right? It's the endurance and courage to do hard things. And so I really like that fortitude. You will see the others in its place, though. So when we commit a moral act, there are three things we have to look at. The intention. What is the end that I'm intending? The action. Is the act that I'm doing is it moral? Am I doing it in a moral manner? And then the circumstances can have an effect on, right? So when we talk about intention and action, if I decide to write a $50,000 check tomorrow, give it to the women's shelter, that seems like a pretty good intention, right? And it's great until we find out that intention's not good. Nothing the matter with writing the check. But the intention, if my intention is I like access to vulnerable women, it's not a moral act, no matter how good it looks, right? Because the intention isn't to a good end. At the same time, if I really feel for them over there, right? And I think, wow, they need more money, they need nicer things, and all of a sudden I start scamming people and, cheating people, stealing things, and I bring all the money and I give it to them, it's still not a moral act. Because you can't commit an evil to create a good, right? It's just not possible. This is where the virtues come in, right? Prudence. What is my intention? Knowing my intention. Temperance, how much can I give, right? I mean, might not seem like much, but if I have $10 and that's what I have, enough $10 bills turn into something, right? So I can do that. With temperance, justice, I see another and they're due help. I should help them to the extent I am capable of. That's what I'm called to, right? And courage. Sometimes it takes courage to say this is all I can do, right? It takes fortitude. I wish I could do more. It's what I got. And being able to admit that and feel good about it, right? Infused with that faith, hope, and love, the love for them that God gives me, the faith that God will do something with it, and the hope that their world will become better, right? We're going to jump. Yep, I did. Okay, so circumstances become important. Who's involved? If you teach theology, if you dabble in philosophy, someone says, well, is it wrong to lie to the Nazis if they come to your door and ask you if you're hiding a Jewish family if they're in the basement? Well, it's kind of this interesting apparent dilemma, right? The question is, do they do the truth? Because their intent is to kill them, right? And you've got two people that you can arguably say you have a duty to. People you have housed to protect, right? And these people that want to commit an evil. By telling them they're there, you would be participating in the evil end. And so it is one of those cases where who's involved, right? Vocations and responsibilities, and the act being done. You can refuse to answer. You know, you can say, I haven't seen them. At the end of the day, that duty, because morality is messy. It's not as clean cut as we would like it to be, right? So you have this tiering of questions, and who's the duty to? Because I've got separated duties. That's discernment on the part of the person doing it. And that's why virtue is something you have to put on yourself. You have to develop your virtue. Aristotle says magnanimous is the goal. To become magnanimous, that's the person that has mastered all virtue. The magnanimous person. They always know what to do. They know how to do it. They know how to do it right. But intent to protect, to do, when you move through. So, we have this problem. We're going to talk about, it's called the double effect. First thing I'm going to say is it's not a hall pass. It's easy to turn into a hall pass. Okay? But the double effect, something bad happens that's foreseeable when I do a good act. So, Thomas Aquinas uses the example of someone breaks into my home, I'm protecting my spouse, they have a gun, I have a gun, I shoot them, my intent not being to kill them, but to stop them from harming the person that I'm supposed to protect, right? Maybe they will, maybe they won't die, but the intent is to protect. If they die, the double effect comes in, because this is a bad moral end. It's an evil. Anytime a person dies, it's an evil. Life should exist. It it doesn't exist, evil exists. But it's not an evil that I am morally culpable for, right? Because my intent was to protect. Now, that means the minimal force necessary, right? It means once the threat's gone, you have to stop. You can't go out to your car, go get another clip, and empty it into the guy at the pharmacy. That's problematic. So that, in that instance, right, the double effect says, no, this comes into current moral issues in a very big way. This comes into health issues, right? So if a woman is pregnant and has uterine cancer, we now have a very difficult decision because there's a great chance that the treatment's going to end up terminating the pregnancy. The woman has a right to treatment, according to the church, a right to preserve her life, a duty to preserve her life, right? And if that's the best treatment possible, and she chooses that, even though it might have the negative consequence of terminating the pregnancy, her intention isn't terminating the pregnancy, it's healing the cancer. And there can be lots of reasons. You know, a woman with 4 or 5 kids, and this arises, and the need for the children to be cared for. And so these are individual decisions that people have to make. What we're called to do as the body of Christ is to love and walk with that person, realizing they've had to make a difficult decision. So while the church says, no, we can never decide to terminate the pregnancy, right? If you have an atopical pregnancy, the only thing you can do is remove it. The intent isn't to abort, again, but it is to make sure that the woman's fallopian tubes don't rupture, right? That she gets good health care. So those issues exist, and they're how we see things. Where the double effect doesn't apply is if I walk into the bank, right, and somebody's robbing it, and I see it happening, and I realize that, you know, I have my Bishop McGinnis issued 9mm in the car. I run out, I get it, I see he's about to shoot the person's about to shoot the clerk, and so pow, I shoot him. Double effect applies, right? But if the only reason I went out to the gun to get the car to get the gun, was because when I walked in, I heard Farrell's voice swinging that gun around, and she had been giving me grief all day. And I just wanted it to be quiet. I didn't care about the clerk. I'm not saving the clerk. I'm shutting things up at the house about the dog food. Now the double effect doesn't apply, right? Because my intent wasn't to save anybody but myself. Does that make sense? So the double effect is rare. You know, it's not this common. You know, the problem is we teach it in high school, and kids double effect around everything. You know, well, I didn't want to put my